Alright, welcome back. So this is going to be a follow-up video to my first video where we talked about local variables and how we can pass those variables across different scopes using blocks. We also covered bindings a little bit in there, which, as a refresher, bindings are a way to grab a hold of a context, and we can use that context later to evaluate Ruby code within that context if we're elsewhere in our programs. So today we're going to look at a kind of real-world use case example of this, and this example comes to us from active support. As you can see here, I'm inside active support testing assertions, and down in this module is where you'll find the assert difference method defined. So this is what we're going to kind of walk through today and look at the code and see how the concepts that we learned in the first video can be applied and how they're used in places in the real world. Alright, so what I've done here is I just created a new Ruby file, assertDifference.rb, and I just copied in the code for our assert difference method just into the file so that we can use it and kind of put some binding.irb calls in throughout it at different points and kind of walk through it line by line and see what's executing, and take a moment to look at places where the concepts we learned about in the last video are being used inside this method. So outside of pulling in the code for the assert difference method, I pulled in one example from the repo. If you go back and look at the code in the repo above where the method is defined, there's actually a few kind of examples of how you can call assert difference. This is the one I just picked that we're going to base our code off of and use to step through this. But there's other ones out there, definitely worth a read through. There's some cool stuff in that. We will be requiring active support and mini-test auto run later. We're not going to use those right now. The other thing I did is I made a very simple article class. We just have a class variable for count, starts at 0. When we make new objects of the article class, we increase the count by 1. We can return the count back with our self.count method, and then when we destroy, we decrement our count by 1. So with that, these two lines will come into play when we pull in active support and mini-test later. We're not going to use these right now. Right now, we're just going to use this block to make 5 new articles, so then our count should be at 5, and then we'll use our assert difference that we have above here to step through the code and play around with it and see what all is happening behind the scenes. So let's dive into this. Here we're going to call assert difference. The arguments we're going to pass into it are article count, -1, which is our difference, and then an article should be destroyed, which is our message argument, as you'll see in a moment. And then we're also going to pass this block that just calls article.destroy. So let's jump up here and let's immediately just put a halt on things as soon as we execute the code. So we'll put a binding IRB in there, and we'll hop over to the terminal, and we will execute this and hit our binding.irb call and just kind of see what is the lay of the land right now. What's our landscape look like of what we have available to us inside this method. All right, so let's go ahead and run the program Ruby assert difference.rb, and we'll see we immediately hit our binding.irb call. So let's just check out the arguments here, right? So we have expression. What is that going to give us? Okay, so that just gives us the first argument that we pass in of article.count. What are args? So arg is an array of the remaining arguments that we passed in, which we can see if we hop back over to the code, would be these two arguments here. So we have those in an array. And then our block we should have also. So there it is. Our block is this proc object right here, and we will be using this later. So let's hop back over to our code editor here and look at this if statement here. So the first thing that we hit is this if statement here, and we immediately check to see if our expression is a hash. Ours in this case is not. We can verify this by running that exact same code over here. Expression.is a hash false. Okay, so we are not going to worry about this section of code at this moment. We're going to go straight to our else clause here. So the first thing we're going to do is assign difference, right? This local variable, keyword right there, local variable, be mindful of that. We're going to assign this right here to the value of arg0 if it's present, or the number 1. So in our case, arg0, we're going to have it, it's going to be -1. So we'll hit enter. There we go. We see we have -1 there. The next thing, as I mentioned a moment ago, our message is going to be the article can be destroyed argument that we pass in. Okay, good. So we have difference in message there. So this last line here, I just want to take a minute and just point out the fact that we're passing this block to map, and we're using difference, which is this variable up here that we defined and assigned. Also, we're using that inside of our block. So here we're seeing kind of some of the techniques we talked about last time, right? We're using the local variable inside a block to kind of get it beyond like any scope gates that we might have created. For instance, like if we would have had a method that wrapped this whole expression here, we would have to either take the variable in as an argument to the method and then use it. But by using this block right here, we can just use it in line right here. But I do want to break this line down a minute, because it looks kind of interesting to say the least, right? There's a little bit going on. There's this hash bracket syntax. We're wrapping our expression in an array and then mapping over it. So let's hop back over to the terminal and take a minute to break this line down into smaller sections so we can see how it is built into a larger expression that returns back our hash. All right, so the first little bit we can pull out here just to break down is array expression, right? So if we run this, we're just going to see that our expression, which again, expression is just the article.count string that we passed in. So if we do array expression, it just creates a new array with that as the single element to it. So the next thing we can look at is, we're going to map over that array. So we're going to be returning an array, right? And that array is going to contain what? Let's see here. So we're mapping over each element. We're going to return from our block a new array that has 2 elements in it, one being the element that we're currently on in our iteration, the second element being difference, which we assigned up here, right? So what we're going to get back from this section of our code is going to be a single array. In this case, we're going to get a single array containing one element, which is also an array that will have 2 elements inside of it. So let's go ahead and run that, and you can see that. So on the outside here, we have our single array. That array has 1 element, which is itself another array containing 2 elements. The first being our string of article.count, and then the next being our difference of 1. So that's pretty cool. Now the last little bit is this hash bracket that we have this whole expression wrapped in. Now, if we go look at this method in the Ruby docs, we'll see here that hash brackets is a public class method on hash if you just do a hash empty brackets, you just get a new empty hash back. If you pass a hash inside the brackets, you will get also a new hash. You can see that an example of that down here. Now the one that we're interested in looking at is this third one here, which is what we just did. So if you look at this, you'll see we have hash, open bracket, and then a single array, and then it says 2 element arrays inside of there, and then we have our closing bracket, closing bracket. So if we look down here and read a little bit more about it, we'll see that when the single given argument is an array of 2 element arrays, it returns a new hash object wherein each 2 element array forms a key value entry. So if we look at the example here, we'll see that we do our hash bracket. We have the main closing bracket out here. The single argument to that is an array, just one single array, but that array has multiple 2 element arrays inside of it, right? So if we go back to our code and look, you can see, you can kind of imagine, so we have hash open bracket. If we go back to the terminal here, we'll see that we'll have our single element, our single array with a single element of another array with the 2 elements inside of it. So when we run this last line of the code here, we will see that we will get back just a hash containing the key of article.count and the value of -1. So let's go ahead and run that. And there we go. So that gives us back our hash. So this one I thought was really fascinating. I've never used this before, so I had fun going looking the docs and look that up. So with that out of the way now, let's go ahead and make sure that we are saving that hash to our expressions variable here. So let's go do that now. I'll say expressions equals, and then I'm just going to use a little trick here. If you're not familiar with this, if you forget to save the evaluation of something to a variable, you can name the variable in the next line and set it equal to underscore, and it will set the last item returned from the previous expression equal to the variable. So I'll just hit enter there, and now we can see if I call expressions again, it contains our hash. Kind of a cool trick. So, okay, let's get back on track here and move into this part, which is where we're going to see the usage of binding. All right, so we can break this line down similar to how we did this line here, just kind of slowly walk through it so that everyone's following along and we have a clear picture of what's going on here. So the first thing we can do is say expressions.keys, which if we look here again, just as a reminder, expressions is a hash. So if we call .keys on it, it's just going to give us an array containing the keys. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to map over that array of keys, and then we're going to see if each element in that array responds to call. In our current case, this article.count string is not going to respond to call, so therefore we're going to fail this ternary here. We will not be returning the element. Instead, we're going to be returning a lambda here. So if we look at this lambda, we can see that inside the body of it, we have a call to eval. This should look familiar from the last video where we talked about bindings. So we're going to eval the element. In our case, that is going to be, again, our string of article.count, and we're going to evaluate that string within the context of the block that we passed in to the method up here. And just as a reminder, so we can look at it, this is the block that I'm referring to here. This is the block that we passed into assert difference. So we're evaluating article.count in the context of that block. So really cool practical use case of one of the concepts we covered in the last video. So, and again, we're going to be returning that as an element inside of the array here, and we're going to hold that inside of our exps variable here. So let's go ahead and run this just so that we have that. Cool. All right, so there's our array, contains our single proc object, and now we're ready to move on to the next section of this code. So down here, we're just going to evaluate those procs. We're going to call them, right? We're going to iterate over that array of procs. In our case, it only has one. And then for each one, we're going to call on it and return that result in an array, right? And we're going to assign that to our before variable here. So if I just copy this and execute that here, we'll see that we just get back an array of 5, which, if we think about it, makes sense because down here we made 5 new articles, and if you evaluate article.count in this context of this block, we've already created those 5 articles, so our count class variable that we started out at 0 should have been incremented to 5, so therefore we get 5 back. So that's great, that's working as it should. And now to go to the next part, here's where we're going to yield to our block, right? And retval, I'm going to go ahead and assume that means return value from the block here. We can go ahead and execute that, and we can see what that will give us back. So that gave us back 4, right? So we yielded to our block. Our block, all it executed was article.destroy. And when we call article.destroy, we decrement our count by 1, right? So now we're getting 4 back. Okay, so this is cool. We're starting to see how this code is working and where it's going next. This is one of the final parts of our method, and we're going to take a moment to really break this one down so that we can fully understand what's going on here as we wrap up the method. All right, so next we're going to look at this zip method here. And this zip method is actually defined in the enumerable module. And if we quickly look at expressions right here, we'll see that expressions is a hash. There's also an array.zip method, but as we can see here, we're working with a hash. So therefore, the one that we want is the enumerable zip method. So they're kind of similar. The way that this one will work in our case here is our hash that we're calling zip on. It's going to first return a main parent array, right? So let's look at just this first line here. So we have a main outer parent array. And then what it's going to do is it's going to grab from our hash, it's going to grab the first key value pair, like our first element out of this hash. It's going to take that along with the first elements from the corresponding arguments that we pass into zip. So in our case, we're passing in exps and before. So it's going to take the first element from expressions, and again, in our case, it's a key value pair. And then it's going to take the first element from exps and the first element from before. It's going to put all of those inside an array nested inside the parent array, as we kind of see here in this example. So we would have our parent array, and then we would have a nested array inside of it with 3 elements in it. Again, the first element being the first key value pair from our expressions hash, the second element being the first element from the exps array, and the first element, and the third element being the first element from our before array. So the interesting thing to note here, though, is that what it's going to do for the key value pair from the hash, it's going to make those a 2-element array. So the first element of the nested array is going to be yet another array of 2 elements, and we'll see this in our next step when we actually execute the code and get a full picture of what's being returned back from our zip method. All right, so let's just run this and let's see what result we get back here. So okay, now we see we have a single array that has a single array inside of it, and then that array has 3 elements in it. The first being an array of 2 elements, then our proc and then 5. Excuse me. Okay, so this is cool. Now we're passing a block to that. So if we go back to the docs and look at zip, if you pass a block to it, I believe it says in here somewhere. Yes, when a block is given, it will call that block for each of the subarrays that were returned from performing the zip. So as a quick example, like each of these little internal arrays, the block would be executed once for each of these arrays. So going back to our code, we only have the one array, so we're just going to run through this once. You'll see that in our block args here, we have this code and diff wrapped in parentheses. What that is going to do is when the code executes, it's going to split out this first element containing these two. It's going to split out this array containing these first two elements, respectively. So article.count will get assigned to code, and -1 is going to be assigned to diff, and then expression will be our proc object, and then 5 will be our before value here. So from here, the code's pretty straightforward. It just goes through, creates an error variable, and it will assign it to this value. But then we also do a check to see if message is there, right? So, and here's another example of, we're using a local variable. We define this local variable way up here. And if we would have created a method to wrap this whole thing in and call it the method here, we would have had to have this method also take in another argument to receive our message. But here we can see we're just using a block, so we can just go ahead and use the local variable right in here. So from there, we're just going to call assert equals, and we're going to add the before value plus the diff, and we're just going to make sure that the value that gets returned from this is equal to calling our expression, and then we'll show any errors otherwise. So that's pretty much how this code works. It's pretty cool. It returns the return value at the end of it. But I thought it was a really cool example to kind of see a lot of the concepts that we talked about in the last video at play here. So if we go ahead and I'll just comment our version out here, and we can bring in active support and our mini test stuff, and I'll bring all this back in, and we can just go ahead and run it just so you can see that we're working here. Let's get out of IRB, and you can see, our test runs just fine. It's just cool to see these things being used in the real world. If you're using mini test in your Rails apps, you're probably using assert difference all the time. It's cool just to dig into that code, see how it works, see some of the techniques being used, and just kind of match up some things that you're learning about and seeing some real application of it in a code base. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will catch up next time. Take care.